here in the seminar on digital sex work in the age of COVID, and especially a very, very warm welcome to our three speakers of today, Velthuis, Angela Jones, and Zaire Krieger, which I honestly think is a wonderful lineup. As far as I'm concerned, we could not have wished better for the theme that we're talking about today. My name is Olav Velthuis. I am a sociologist here at the University of Amsterdam and just starting a research project together with a colleague, Thomas Poel, on webcam sex platforms. And this is the second in a series of 3 webinars that are part of a new research initiative at the university called Global Digital Cultures. And so today the webinar will be about the digitization of sex work. And since part of what we will be talking about considers platforms for so-called webcam sex work, which you may or may not be familiar with, I thought it would be a good idea to at least show just 2 screenshots of what those platforms would, what they look like. So I'm going to share my screen here. This is a screenshot of a highly popular platform called Chaturbate. And what you're looking at is a lineup, and like this, there will be, well, at any point in time, usually more than 1,000 thumbnails being placed of performers in different categories. And once you click on one of those thumbnails, you are going to a page that looks like this, where you will have a video screen where you see the performer, and you have a chat box where you can chat with the performer. And in this case, you can also tip the performer for the performance she or he is giving. So this, I mean, just a really general idea of what these platforms look like. The format of the seminar or the webinar will be that all 3 speakers give a short 5-minute opening statement, followed by some follow-up questions from me. Then there will be a discussion among the speakers, and that will be followed by questions from you, from the audience. And for now, I mean, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, and that is Velthuis, who is a sex worker and a sex workers' rights activist, and who is also, I mean, I think in the Dutch and also international media, you can see and hear and read her right regularly. And since recently, she's managing editor of Red Insights. Should I do some marketing for you, Yvette? This is redinsights.org.
.org, yes.
Yeah, I'll put it also in the chat so that people know the address. And it's a new and really wonderful news and knowledge platform for sex workers in the Netherlands. So the floor is to you, Yvette, and a very warm welcome here.
Thank you. First of all, I think you're still sharing your screen, Olav.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. Thanks for telling me. There you go. Thanks, Yvette.
Well, thank you for that introduction. First of all, I would like to add to your request for people to keep their webcams on. I know that there will be sex workers in the room, and I know there will be people here who have other reasons to not be visible. Please don't take care of me if you don't want to be seen. Don't feel like you should, because I'm quite used to speaking to just a hole in my laptop. Having that said, my name is Velthuis. I'm 35 years old, and I've been I started in the industry like 10 years ago in porn performance, and I've been webcamming on a more regular and less regular basis for 5 years now. And one of the main questions I've been hearing over the last few months is, are sex workers moving online? Can you not just go online if you are an offline sex worker? Will people now stay online forever, and things like that. And yeah, there is a lot to do about the subject. And since I also assume there are a lot of non-sex workers here, I would like to give a quick introduction of the things you need to do in order to become a webcam performer. This is sort of the very short version of a workshop I have been giving for Humanitas. You can find a longer version of it online as well. Yeah, so when you start webcamming, there are several things you need. You need a computer. You probably will want to have an HD camera. I sort of I'm not in my own home. We decided to go to my parents-in-law quite unexpectedly. So I grabbed my laptop and I did not grab my HD camera, which is actually for me funny because I'm so used to looking at my own face in a very crisp and clear way that I'm constantly really shocked how I look now. Probably if you look at the other speakers, they will have better image quality. So that's an HD camera or not. So you need access to Wi-Fi or to quick internet, which can be Wi-Fi, but preferably over cable. You need a bunch of light. Right now I'm sitting in an outside space like with glass above me. You would also, so if you don't have access to a lot of light, you need like lamps. For that, you probably also need a private space. So having all those things is already like a bunch of stuff you need in order to be able to start a show even, or to webcam. To start a show is a different thing because then you also need an account on a website. Of course, you can arrange your own clients, maybe through Skype or something, or through Dutch websites like Kinky.nl or sex jobs, where you can find a client and then maybe organize your own sex work. But there are like a bunch of webcam sites that really help you get clients, like Chaturbate we just saw. But in order to get online like that, you also need to have profile pictures, you need to have an international bank account, you need to be able to identify with probably a passport or an ID card. So there's a lot of work involved and a lot. Am I on time? Is someone keeping time? Because I think I have 1 more minute, or am I done? I'm looking at Olav, whose mouth is moving, but all right. I'm not sure what you say, but I think I still got 1 minute.
1 minute would be great.
Good, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, so you have that. You need to have your technical stuff. You need to have your ability to identify and go on contract in a way with a website, and then there's like a lot of things to take care of to become successful, which includes marketing, which includes creating a brand for yourself, thinking how do I want to present, how do I not want to present, what are my own boundaries, how do I take care of myself while doing this and be sustainable in that career. So just going online is not necessarily a thing you just do, or not necessarily, it's not a thing you just do. Yeah, so far so good.
Yeah. Hey, Yvette, if I can just follow up on that. So, so that snapshot of what it takes to become a webcam performer, what does it mean in terms of who has access in the end to these platforms and who hasn't? So, if you think in terms of like internet access, a camera, a space, a private space, and maybe not just in the Netherlands, but beyond, yeah, in other parts of the world. What does it mean? Like what kind of inequalities does it create when it comes to getting access to this form of digital sex work?
Well, you need to have like a certain privilege to at least end up high in the rankings. A lot of algorithm programming is of course done in these websites as well. So the more privileged you are and the more money you have to spend on technical quality, the higher you end up on a website. The easier it is to make money. So when you are in a non-internet adjusted country, that's already more difficult, and we know that performers of color make less money than white performers, and so yeah, it's in that sense not different than the rest of capitalist world.
Yeah. Yeah, hey, and sometimes you read, by the way, also in Angela Jones's book, which I'll mention in a second, that it could be the case that because of digital possibilities to perform sex work, more people would have access to it. So people who maybe wouldn't be inclined to do offline, physically interactive sex work would be inclined to do it online. How do you see that? Do you think this this?
I think this is partly true and partly untrue. For some people, it will open up possibilities that they did not have before, and I think definitely in terms of physical abilities. If you are using a wheelchair to get around, then being in your own space, setting up your own space is a lot more accessible than when you are able to do street work or not able to do street work. So there's a difference there. But then again, there are people, especially now during times of Corona, there are people who already did not have access to money to get all the technical set needs, and yeah, they won't have that now. There is a virus going on, so people who were doing survival sex work and street-based survival sex work specifically, yeah, their situation hasn't changed. So yes, it gives access, but it also declines access.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, and the last question for now, I would be curious about, in the 5 years that you have been doing online sex work yourself, have you experienced changes? Has the online scene become different compared to 5 years ago?
For me, that's hard to say because I'm not really a scene kid, so to speak. I'm more involved with my offline community here in the Netherlands than I am involved with my online community online. Yeah. Yeah, there's like a constant innovation of websites and possibilities and technical quality and hookups with interactive toys and stuff like that. So it's there's a lot of tech-driven innovation going on. And maybe it's also good to mention that. So I have a background in porn, and then when I started camming, you sort of need to get yourself out there again. Being online now, or findable for 10 years now in total, I have seen my following grow, even though I'm not branding or promoting myself as hard, but like spending time within a career will give you more opportunities as well, which I didn't have when I just started. I can rely on a fan base now, which I couldn't when I just started. So for me personally, that changed over time, and also the hourly rate I was able to make.
It changed to the better or to the worse?
It changed to the better. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Good. Okay, thanks. We'll get back to these themes later on in the discussion. But let's for now move on to Angela Jones, who has a past as a sex worker, but is now associate professor of sociology at Farmingdale State College, which is part of the State University of New York. And she is also author of the book Camming, Money, Power and Pleasure in the Sex Work Industry, which I would say is the first comprehensive book on this field. And I would definitely say that it is an absolute must to read for anybody interested in this topic. So it's a really big pleasure to have you here in the webinar, Angela, and the floor is to you.
I'm really excited. Thank you for that really warm welcome. I appreciate that. So I'm really excited about this conversation. If it's okay, I want to start with a little story. So in about mid-March, right as things were getting really bad here in the States, and especially in New York, where I am, I started getting lots of messages asking about how I thought COVID would affect camming and sex work more broadly. And especially people were sharing this one article with me, which I just recently dropped in the chat. But it was a New York Post article entitled "Business Booming for Cam Girls Amid Coronavirus Outbreak." And I immediately, and many people are sending me this article, and I immediately thought to myself, you know, booming for whom, right? Like the article and the conversations I saw playing out among non-sex workers were going something like this. Government agencies are shutting down, you know, studio porn production, brothels, red light districts, strip clubs, massage parlors, and so forth. And this would leave some of these workers looking to camming as a resolution to lost wages, especially given that many of these workers in the US, for example, are ineligible for government stimulus. However, sex workers migrating online are moving into an already saturated and highly competitive industry that privileges specific workers. So as I show in my book, Camming, while high incomes in the industry do occur, such earnings generally occur among, and again, generally occur among young, white, thin, cisgender women who've spent years building popular brands, have a sizable client following. So as Yvette was alluding to, I think, you know, breaking into the industry can be difficult, right? It requires much time, skill, decent equipment. So I guess I want to say, if business is booming, I bet it's primarily for a segment of cam models who are well-known, either porn stars or other sex workers, or again, already existing cam models who have followings. So again, in light of all of these communications that I was getting from people and just my general kind of interest in this area, I wanted to kind of gauge the effects of the pandemic on camming, and specifically on cam models. And so I reached out to a few cam models who participated in my research for the book, and frankly, who I continue to have conversations with. And I continue to have conversations with sex worker friends and activists here in the States primarily. And their stories, you know, for me, painted a much different picture of the global pandemic's effects on the camming industry than that article does, right? So here's the bottom line. Yes, more people around the world are home, but many performers and customers are home with families, right? Like I'm home with my kid. Like I was rushing to get on this webinar, trying to help my kid with his math homework right before I even got online. And I'm sure he has questions, which I'll get to in 30 minutes. But he's done. But the point is, sorry. So yeah, many performers and customers are home with families, right? And now unemployed clients are cutting back, maybe cutting back on spending. You know, so we could say clients will still log on to get off, but if they're not spending, there's an increase in what many cam models or broadcasters call freeloaders, right? And so a terrible situation emerges. So in essence, more competition means more extended hours and more work with even lower wages, right? And I was also thinking about, given like the mental health toll of the pandemic, it's also critical to consider how taxing it must be for people to perform sexual labor for long hours for inadequate compensation. So again, as I argue in camming, the industry is saturated, right? It's saturated with workers well before the pandemic hit. And unfortunately, you know, my sense is that, you know, migrating online or camming will not necessarily provide the economic stimulus many are looking for in the industry. right? So in the book, I posit that the inequality, and this, Olav, you and Yvette were really getting at this, that the inequality generated by global capitalism, by transnational capitalism, means that for so many people around the world, the costs associated with becoming a CAM model are prohibitive, and access to the technologies and the private space required to CAM are not available. So to me, the pandemic only exacerbates this reality, right? Critically, increased market saturation, the class-based and racial disparities in healthcare access and infection, and the digital divide undoubtedly mean that while already successful porn stars and CAM models might just be seeing a boom, the most marginal workers will not, if they're even able to work at all. So I guess I'll stop there.
Well, so I wouldn't mind continuing there. So if you could talk a little bit more about this competition and especially how that works out in a global setting. So one way to think of it would be, well, you have like countries with high wages and high cost of living in the United States and Europe and other regions in the world. And then there are regions with low cost of living. So if it is really a global competition, so if these platforms kind of aggregate and have together sex workers from all over the world, would it really mean that like wages are going to be driven down to levels where only sex workers from countries where the cost of living is low would be able to survive? Or how does that is there like a real global competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly global competition. Again, I think there's two things. One, there were vast differences in people's experiences based on their location in the world, right? So clearly, folks who I talked to, I'm thinking of CAM models in Hungary and Romania, like there were other people I talked to who said, look, when I make, even in Spain, who said, look, when I make an extra $1,500, $2,000 US dollars a month, right? Like that, to me is very significant in terms of my access to resources. Whereas, somebody living in the States, especially in an urban center like New York, is like an extra $1,500 a month. It's just a drop in the bucket. Like that doesn't even pay my damn rent, But I think you raise also another interesting question. And I think this is something that you and Yvette were first starting to get at in terms of kind of saturation and kind of how that's changed over time. So there were a number of CAM models who I talked to who have, been sex workers for, the better part of 2 decades. And had this really interesting or unique vantage point from which to think about the camming market, right? Because they'd started like in the late 90s, right? And really saw it evolve. And so like, look, when they first started, they just popped online, didn't have to really think about a, highly designed show. They're not playing games. There's no Twitter account, and they said over time, there became other demands in terms of, for example, really managing a brand, right? And having to actively market yourself and how time consuming that became, right? Where, now they have a Snapchat, a Twitter, and, as Yvette was saying, with all these technological developments means these folks need to, keep up with those developments, which one, getting back to the inequality here, right? This now becomes costly. It becomes time consuming, and also thinking in terms of one's wages or earnings. To me, there's a difference if I'm just logging on and doing, or somebody's logging on and doing a show for say 2 hours, right? And that's it, that's all the work they do, as opposed to somebody who now has to manage a Twitter following, right? Communicate offline, maybe they have a separate cell phone. And so now they're, charging, they're increasingly creating content, right? Which again can create this additional stream of revenue, right? Like if you also have an OnlyFans account, or if now you have this following that you're distributing everything from, I don't know, pornographic content, pictures, videos, I don't know, panties, there's this additional stream of income. But at the same time, the thing that I heard a lot from both CAM models in my research and just frankly, sex workers in my life, so that like this can become really demanding, take away from some of the pleasure of the work. Like now it's really starting to feel more like, boring vanilla work, right? And also, and I'll sum up here, but something else I thought was really interesting, and I'm thinking of a long-term sex worker that I talked to from the UK who said, and was talking specifically about market saturation and said, one of the things, and she wasn't the only person who talked about this, but said like, it was profound for me because she said that she had to take a break from camming because she said that she was finding, in her opinion, that clients were asking for more, right? Like when she started a decade ago, like she would barely even take off her clothes for like the first hour, you know, and that now clients were becoming more demanding, you know, asking for a lot of, you know, sexual activities or performances that they were increasingly not comfortable with, like a lot more kink, BDSM work, which, you know, for a lot of folks are like, first of all, I'm not technically proficient in this work. I get that it's lucrative, you know, but they're asking me to perform things. And again, I'm thinking this particular cam model from the UK who said, look, I had to take a break because it just felt like in order to be, Yvette was talking about this, in order to be, you know, in that top, you know, thinking about the algorithms these sites use, in order to be at the top of the page, folks, you know, that I talked to said, you know, I'm starting to feel like in order to be competitive in this saturated market, that I have to perform things that I'm just not comfortable with, right? That there's an increasing demand for things that like I wouldn't have been asked for or wouldn't have felt compelled to do, you know, 10 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. But that's, I mean, I hope we can get back to that in the discussion. It is a fairly dystopian picture that is, yeah, that comes into being there, with wages dropping, people having to do more extreme things, a small group of performers getting a lot of profits, and something that we didn't talk about yet, those platforms themselves taking a huge cut out of the earnings. So I hope that we can talk further about what to do about this saturation of the markets.
Absolutely.
Discussion.
And I just want to add really quick, and I think because Yvette was getting at this, and I hope part of that discussion is attentive to how this reality is racialized and classed and gendered and has to do with ability. Because again, my concern is primarily about the marginal workers. So again, I think there are a lot of folks who are surviving and thriving online in this environment, but I think it's interesting to think about who's more likely to be surviving and thriving in this market, you know, and who's more likely to be at the bottom of that page, not necessarily earning much money at all.
Great. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to now turn to the third speaker, Zaire Krieger, who is a spoken word artist. She has a BA in International and European Law. She works as a journalist, has done research for the Dutch NGO Bits of Freedom on an American law that is supposedly addressing human trafficking. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Zaire, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm gonna try and build on the previous speakers, even though what I do doesn't necessarily touch on COVID, or what I've done doesn't necessarily touch on COVID. So about 2 years ago, there was a law that was passed in the United States. It was called FOSTA-SESTA. And FOSTA-SESTA roughly stands for Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, basically. The reasoning for this had to do with a site called Backpage, and Backpage was single-handedly responsible for a large part of sex trafficking advertisements online. And because they wanted to be able to convict Backpage, they sort of drew up this law that enabled them to convict platforms for what the users posted. This was significant because it was sort of technically chipping away at a very important freedom of speech online law called Section 230. I'm not going to bore you with like the legal implications of whatever, but Section 230 basically is called the law that created the internet as we know it, because it created a situation where platforms, Facebook, Google, whatever platform you're on, they are not liable for whatever you post. So they are not concerned with censoring you and every single comment personally, because they don't have to, because they're not legally liable for what you post. You are liable for what you post, logically. Now, what FOSTA-SESTA did is, we're going to make platforms liable if we find that they have sex trafficking advertisements on their site. What's problematic about this is that, first of all, knowing the difference between what is sex trafficking and what is sex work online in an advertisement can be super difficult. In my research, I spoke to the Dutch police, and they are having ridiculous difficulty with this. And because they are having so much difficulty with this, they are just cracking down on sex workers, not necessarily sex trafficking. So basically the law inadvertently asks platforms to act as policemen online, to know the difference between a sex trafficking advertisement and a sex worker advertisement. So that's problematic, because could you even ask a platform to be able to do that? Secondly, because it is so difficult to know what all your users are posting, a lot of platforms were changing their terms of agreements. Some silently, some overtly. So, example, Facebook changed their terms of agreement, basically saying, okay, no one ever on our platform can ask for sex at all. So if you were to post as just a regular user, excuse my French, wanna fuck, if you were to ask that, that technically would be against the terms of agreement of Facebook because of FOSTA SESTA. Now, what we're seeing here is that obviously Facebook has a ridiculously large monopoly position in the online market. So FOSTA SESTA as an American law, because it changed our terms of agreements, has an effect on every single user around the world, not just American users. It has an effect on every single sex worker around the world. So it's problematic because you're making platforms out to be policemen, which they can't do. It's problematic because it only solidifies the monopoly position that a lot of these platforms already have. A really good example is Pounced. Pounced was a smaller platform. And because they were so small, they said, listen, we can't continue being this platform because we do not have the money to have all this litigation. If you are Facebook and you have a large battery of lawyers to protect yourself against any sort of liability, you can do whatever you want. But if you are a smaller platform, you can't enter the market like that. So it only solidifies the already humongous monopoly position that Google, Facebook, and these large platforms have. Now, so it's not problematic for the platforms themselves. It's problematic for sort of the market of platforms. It's problematic for users because we don't know what we can and can't say. It censors us. But the largest group that is being affected are sex workers. One of the things that happened right after FOSTA SESTA got implemented is that a lot of sex workers were saying, being online gave me agency. It gave me an ability to screen my clients. It gave me ability to set my own prices, to set my own times. But if you cannot work online, because as some of you might know, I forgot to explain this, but the law does differentiate technically between legal and illegal sex work. The funny, obviously, thing is that the only place where sex work is technically fully legal is some places in Nevada. So really what the law does, it completely shuts down any sort of sex advertisements anywhere. Mm-hmm. So a lot of sex workers were pushed offline on the streets. So one of the horrible side effects of FOSTA SESTA is that there has been a spike, according to some sex worker activist groups, spikes in deaths of sex workers. And sort of to wrap all of this up, to just show you how ridiculous this whole thing was, the original reason why FOSTA SESTA was created was Backpage, this site. Interestingly enough, Backpage was convicted on the basis of regular criminal law. In other words, FOSTA SESTA, this special act that was going to save all this sex trafficking from happening, didn't actually do what it was intended to do, because Backpage got convicted on basic criminal law. And these guys are in jail for enabling sex trafficking of minors. Right now, as of right now, the laws is still being fought by mostly one of the big players is Electric Frontier Foundation. Really good site to look up if you want to know anything about freedom of speech online. The court said that it didn't have standing to fight the law because they weren't directly affected. You have to be directly affected to have standing for law. But as of 2020 January, it was said that they did have standing. So now that case is going to be moved on, and we are finally going to get to the actual content of the law and whether it actually infringes upon freedom of speech. So that is sort of the research that I have done. Because I only have 5 minutes, I sort of only got to the mostly American consequences. But I did speak to, for example, a site like Kinky, which is a Dutch site, and sex workers over there are also affected. So yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to share with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. I have one. It's probably a stupid question, and I should know myself, but I don't. And that is why is Twitter still? Why does it? Is it still possible to, for sex workers to? So in spite of Foster says that to well kind of market themselves there.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I've spoken to a few sex workers. I mean, maybe Yvette and Angela can speak on this more, but from what I've seen is that shadow banning is something that happens quite often. So if you have built up a client base of over 5 years on Twitter, and all of a sudden your clients are saying, hey, we can't find your tweets, or we can't see you, I don't know what you're doing. And that's sort of one really problematic thing about FAST-CESTA is that because platforms didn't want to be liable in any way, shape, or form, some of them silently changed their terms of agreement, or just literally started deleting pictures and videos on like docs, like just deleting stuff without the users even knowing. So there wasn't really much transparency on how these platforms are implementing this law. And they will probably deny forever that it's because of FAST-CESTA. It probably is.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And another question I would have pertains to the Dutch situation. So there is this bill now, a new bill on regulating sex work in the Netherlands, which will probably, or the planning is, I think, to have it in the parliament in the fall. Do you know if there are any initiatives like FAST-CESTA in the Netherlands, or in general? I mean, do you know how the Dutch government, if and how it wants to regulate online sex work in the Netherlands?
The Dutch sphere tends to be a little bit more tricky because you also have EU law. That it takes a very important case for sort of freedom of expression and liability in regards to platforms is the Delphi case, which is an Estonian case in which someone who posted something, the platform was held liable. So the jurisprudence on EU law is a little bit tricky because it's not that easy of a case. I'm not, the thing is like FAST-CESTA is having such an impact on so many platforms that I don't, if it's like working, I don't think we would even need to have a Dutch law here. Like if you were able to crack down on sex work on Facebook, Google, Twitter, literally any international site, like it doesn't, there's no need to do that in the Netherlands as much. I'm not well read on whatever the Christians are doing in the Netherlands. I don't know, but.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, I would like to open the discussion to the three of you, and it's just a general question for now. Does any of you want to pick up on the themes that the others have been addressing in their statements? Yeah, Yvette, go for it.
Yeah, I would like to address that we do indeed have a law coming up, which is going to be discussed in Parliament this fall, and this has a very unspecified licensing system written within that law, and it will basically criminalize every sex worker who will not be able to get a license or who will not apply for a license. And license means registration, so it's the registration of sex workers, which sex workers have been fighting against for years and years and years. So it's a law sex workers really don't want, and it will criminalize sex workers, clients, and third parties. And it looks like they intend that they will also criminalize online third parties, like websites who are offering advertisement space for offline sex work. So yeah, that's even stronger than a FAST-CESTA, because they will just not even about human trafficking. It's about sex workers not having a registration, being criminalized.
Also, if you do webcam sex work, would you also?
No, this will be specifically on prostitution, but yeah, because it's such an unclear law still.
It sounds like a mess to me.
Yeah, it is a mess, because who's going to draw the line? I mean, when you are a webcammer, a Dutch webcammer who is also offering offline services, will your website be held accountable if people find you in, like, it's
that sounds like an absolute mess of the law. Like the implications of sort of freedom of speech online, as well as the fact that there often are only a limited amount of licenses that they will give out in a particular area, right? Like, man, wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, well, it's called the WRS, the Wetregulering Sekswerk, and sex workers are fighting really hard to not get that through Parliament, for all of us. Yeah.
I just wanted to chime in very quickly. I'm conscious of the time about, FOSTA SESTA and what I'm seeing in some of the research that I've been doing now. So my most recent research project, I've been interviewing transmasculine and non-binary escorts, and this was not just limited to the US. So folks in everywhere from Thailand to Belgium to a range of countries. I won't give you the exhaustive list, but like what I'm hearing is that like FOSTA SESTA has like is the deleterious transnational harms, right? Like this is affecting people, around the world. And I just wanted to note that I dropped in the chat some more information about the most recent attempts in the US against FOSTA SESTA, because there was September 2nd, the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, along with some other plaintiffs, did file another motion for a summary of judgment, basically seeking to declare FOSTA unconstitutional. So this was the most recent development. And again, I put that in the chat for anybody who's interested.
Hey, I would be from all three of you really interested in what we were talking about, and I think also what Angela and Yvette were talking about before, this idea of saturation and this sense of unfairness and deep inequality that you see on platforms. And there's also one question from one of the people in the online audience, from Edina Krsmanovic from Utrecht University, and that is, what strategies can we think of, can performers think of to establish a more fair work environment and to fight the biases, especially of artificial intelligence and the algorithms and this kind of winner-take-all structure that they seem to create and propel, where a small number of performers are reaping all the profits and the platforms are reaping, because I mean, nobody has said that explicitly so far, but it would be good for the audience who doesn't know to know that usually more than 50% of every dollar or euro that is earned on a platform is going to the platform itself and not to the worker. How can we, do you have any ideas about how a fairer work environment in digital sex work can somehow be fostered?
I was gonna say, I have ideas, but I would prefer to get out of the way and let Yvette talk first.
Well, thank you. I would say decriminalization of sex work in all its forms. That you don't have to be reliable on like a big company to even have access to clients, or to have access to a safe financial space. I mean, if you want to arrange your own clients and set up a real life date or an online date, you should be able to maintain your privacy. And for instance, the banking system doesn't allow sex workers to have a business bank account, so that will put you in danger of privacy, but also the fact that you, especially in times like these, you should have to be able to mobile in a way, to move in online and offline spaces just easily without being obstructed by law or danger.
But Yvette, when you say that it would be great if you wouldn't be relying on one of the big multinational platform companies, or multinational, I mean American, I think usually, what alternative would you be thinking of? I mean, I guess the advantage of these platforms is that they also attract a huge number of potential clients, and how could that be organized alternatively?
Well, it's the monopoly, right? As long as we deny sex workers their rights, just in general, sex workers don't have time to start corporations and stuff like that, and to build their own systems for their own needs. So decrim would, I think, for the online and the offline world, be a very important first step.
And have like cooperatively established platforms.
If people would be interested in that, yes. Yeah.
I can add to this that there was sort of, because of the shadow banning on Twitter, there was Twitter created, sex worker Twitter. I'm not sure on the status of it now, but indeed the network problem, what we call the network problem, is you want to be where everybody is, and that creates sort of an automatic monopoly position for whatever that platform is just sort of really the name of the game, and it's really impossible almost to sort of crack, like to figure out how to fix that. I mean, I wouldn't know, so.
So I think, so I see the question in the chat and specific strategies that CAM performers can use, right? I think like, look, some of this requires that these CAM sites make structural changes or, you know, reconfigure their algorithms, which I don't think we should hold our breath for most of them anyway. But so for example, you know, you're talking about the CAM sites themselves. I would say, you know, do research on the CAM sites, right? Just in terms of, you know, what determines their algorithm, right? So for example, think about, you know, Chaturbate, where the algorithm is determined by the number of viewers in your room. Whereas if you look at a site like My Free Cams, the structure of that CAM score makes it even harder, you know, to be successful. So maybe doing some research about the structure of the CAM site, the type of algorithm that they're using, you know, turn to the community. There are a lot of online community forums, you know, where people are posting tips, tricks, you know, best practices, go there. Something that I heard just in terms of navigating, especially sexual racism and, you know, and thinking about all this inequality exists. I talked to a lot of CAM models who they'll mess with their filters, right? So if we know that, you know, CAM models disproportionately from the US, maybe to a lesser extent the UK, tend to have some advantages over folks, say in Colombia, for example, you know, folks will mess with their filters and say that they're in a country that they're not, right? Like say that they're in the US, or even in terms of their racial filters, right? We'll list mixed race. You know, if they are passing, they will list white. I think that's a whole conversation, a whole nother conversation in and of itself, that folks have to strategically brand themselves in this way to be successful. But I think
what would be, I'm sorry to interrupt, Angela, but what would be a good alternative algorithm? So now I think a lot of the algorithms, they kind of propel success. Once you're successful, you will become even more successful. What would be an alternative? I mean, you do, if you think of like, lining up thumbnails, what would be a good way of doing that?
I mean, I guess part of me ideally would love to see them think about, you know, inclusion policies, right? And designing algorithms that take folks who are at the bottom and give them a boost, so that this isn't, right, so we don't see this self-fulfilling prophecy continue to emerge where the people at the top continue to stay there, right?
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to echo what Yvette was saying, because the second part of the question, I think, was more political, right? Like I started labor organizing when I was 13 years old. So organizing is always going to be the answer for me. One of the things that I found really intriguing about my research about the camming industry is that there's this really super vibrant, both off and online community that, you know, when I think about sex worker organizing, I don't know that I necessarily see that happening, you know, among some CAM models, right? Although that can be reductive, because I don't think that we should assume that people are just working. Like I also saw a question from Kavita, like I don't think that we should always assume that, you know, people who are CAM models are also not escorts, or also not pro-doms, or also not working in other industries, right? But organizing.
Yeah, and so the question of Kavita was if there in terms of different forms of sex work, online, offline, do you see a hierarchy there between different types of sex work, or different, so hierarchies within the sex trades?
I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in. So I think, I mean, this is something that we've seen play out for decades. I know when I first started, you know, the research project on camming, some of the initial cam models that I talked to kind of did this posturing, right? This distinguishing, right? And saying, well, I'm just a model. I'm just a model. But like, so I think that there is most certainly this hierarchy. But again, I think it's sometimes a misstep to assume that, you know, in this case, that cam models are only cam models, right? That like, again, I think there are a lot of cam models who work in other industries. And so thinking about that hierarchy, I think is just complicated because we might, put another way, we might be inclined to say, well, you know, camming and cam models are in this privileged position within the sex industry. But again, that assumes that's all they're doing. And I think that, again, that's not always the case.
Zaire or Yvette, do you have a take on this absence, presence of a hierarchy in different forms of sex work?
Well, there is, of course, a hierarchy in the sex industry. I mean, we call it a hierarchy for a reason. I think that also shifts through time and through people's own perceptions. I think there are people who are, well, I might be working in a brothel, but at least you can't find me online. And there might be people who are like, well, I am a porn star, but at least I don't have to do shows, and the other way around. So I think within sex workers themselves, there's of course also like internalized stigma that has been brought upon us by society, and that sometimes shows up in different ways.
Yeah.
I'm not saying, and I also want to say that not every sex worker feels like that, and especially because we have so much online resources these days. I think sex workers who want to organize, or sex workers who want to learn from other sex workers, have easier access to sex worker knowledge.
Yeah. Hey, and now that you bring up stigma, Yvette, there was also a question about that from one of the people in the audience, and related broader to what the move or what the digital sex work and the expansion of platform sex work, what has it done to stigma? Has it done anything to stigma, to the good or to the bad? Has it decreased, increased the stigma related to sex work? I mean, it's a question again for all of you, not necessarily, I don't want to put you on the spot, Yvette.
Well, to be honest, I also don't really have an answer. It might destigmatize in some spaces, but it also may not necessarily for all spaces. Yeah, I don't know if someone counted how much stigma we experience.
Yeah. Zaire or Angela, do you have a take on this?
It's kind of just echoing Yvette, right? Like, I think, you know, it's subjective, right? I think that for some people, they might argue that, you know, certainly there's less stigma. I mean, I think in general, one of the things, and I was thinking about this before, you know, I think we're seeing more of this, what we might call this demystification of porn, or this democratization of porn. And so I think there are some benefits here. I think in many ways, yeah, maybe, you know, the prevalence or the pervasiveness of pornographic imagery in some ways decreases stigma, but I would say not for a lot of sex workers, and especially not for full service providers, right? So maybe it's become more commonplace or normalized to throw some pics up on OnlyVids, but I'm not convinced that, you know, say the stigma, you know, that trans women of color working offline and sex work, you know, is any better at all, if not worse, right?
Hey, another question that is coming in from the audience, and by the way, I mean, we are 4 minutes to the end of this webinar, and there are so many good questions coming in, so I already feel the frustration boiling up. But one question that is coming in, and it pertains also to one of the questions that was listed in the in the blurb for this webinar is when it comes to risks related to online sex work, and particularly related to, well, I mean, you were describing how you would do it from your private home, usually your private bedroom. What kind of risks related to a division, keeping up a division between private and working life does webcamming present? That would be both for well, again, for all of you, but in particular for Yvette, I guess, and Angela.
I don't think I can really answer, because my work, my sex work as well as my activism has always been like very much sewn through my life. So I don't know how if I could even distinguish the two.
Yeah. And there's
no, I don't. For my sex work, well, it takes up some space in my house, but I also use that space when I'm not sex working. So I do, of course, take care. I do separate my real name and my work name for privacy reasons, but also to maintain my privilege. The fact that when you Google my real name, you will find a lot of interviews and not necessarily a close-up of my pussy, and that helps me, how horrible it is, but I think it helps me in my activism when people find an articulated interview before they see my sexual side, because yeah, that's how taboo sexuality is, and how stigmatized sex work is.
And Angela, in the sex workers that you have been interviewing for your camming book, was it something that they wanted to do, so to keep a distinction between work, private, and did they have any, I don't know, rituals, procedures, etc. to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we're inclined to say that camming and online sex work and camming in particular is safer, right? Because I think that's how the conversation began. But yet there's, the danger of being capped and doxxed and harassed. And I've been thinking, in writing the book in particular, in listening to people's narratives, thinking about the psychological costs sometimes of this work, right? Like sometimes it's fun and pleasurable, but other times, if people online are constantly harassing you, and again, I like to think about this intersectionally, right? So thinking specifically, it just came to my mind, a woman named Adeline in the book, who's trans feminine, was talking about the number of kind of transphobic trolls that she often has to deal with in the course of her work. And how taxing that can be, and talking to performers of color who have said, like, look, like the racist trolls, like sometimes they just don't stop, and like I literally have to log off because I can't deal with them. And that, and cam models will often have to do quite a bit of labor and work to protect themselves, getting at this private public piece that, like, if you got geotags on, you got to turn them off, right? Like there's like, I've heard the wildest stories, right? Like a cam model talked about, from the US, was like camming outside, like in her backyard, and mentioned that she was selling her house, like just gave some kind of what seemed like benign or innocuous details. And some client, because this, I guess, have none better to do at their time, like went online, used very particular details, used what we have here, it's called a multiple listing service, to like find the house that she was selling because she happened to mention the city that she lives, and then physically stalked her in person. So while this may seem like an exceptional case, I think, again, these forums, these online forums that cam models have created are rich with information and best practices for protecting yourself online, and again, making sure that people can't find you online. Again, beyond just creating that manufactured identity and like, okay, this is my performance name, and taking these extra measures and steps to try to keep people, from being able to dox you and stalk you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to break in, I'm sometimes actually forget about that part of the work, but it's indeed still work, and it feels like it feels like part of the job, which it shouldn't be.
Right, it shouldn't be. I when I was researching, I think I shouldn't have been surprised, but I kind of was, by the amount of sort of emotional toll it took on the people that I was interviewing, and how much, you know, you have to, when you're researching stuff like that, you have to treat it with care. And you know, we can speak about data and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, we're speaking about people's lives. And the stories that I have heard of people being, you know, put outside their house because people found out where they lived, people talking to police about them, neighbors finding out what they were doing at home, you know, that stuff is real. And I think what you said about unionizing is so important, because what I've seen is that they have lists of companies that they can use. So a lot of people don't know this, but if you are a sex worker in the Netherlands and you are using particular banks, for example, you cannot open accounts with particular banks. So they have lists of sites and platforms that they are able to use safely, that don't share their information. Yeah, it's you really, really need to protect yourself, which indeed it shouldn't be like that, but it unfortunately is the case. So.
Hey, it is past 4 o'clock, and I would honestly like to continue for at least another hour, and there would be so many good questions to really do continue for another hour, but we made this agreement to keep this to a 1 hour webinar. I thought it was really great. I learned so much, so I really want to thank all three of you for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today. There are some comments of people going out of the seminar that are very, very warm and positive. So I think the pleasure was shared by many people. I also want to mention, and this is not, I mean, this is really not planned, but I see also so many people that I know because I've been reading their work on sex work in this seminar, that it would be great, and you should feel free to mail me to establish more of a community. I mean, of course, there are already also academic communities on sex work, but on digital sex work in particular, where, yeah, I think a goal that we would all share would be to develop knowledge that is also helpful for thinking through these problems related to inequality and unfairness in this digital workplace. So feel absolutely free to drop me a line. So I'm saying this also to all the audience members, because it might be a good opportunity to like expand the community of people, yeah, thinking about this. But again, I really want to thank all three speakers. Yeah, and that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.